Dr. Yoon received her PhD in sociology from Princeton University, and before arriving to Notre Dame, she held positions at the University of Pennsylvania, Osaka University, and Ewha Women's University. Dr. Yoon is an ethnographer who has spent many years conducting in-depth fieldwork in Korean diasporic communities in Seoul, Beijing, and Osaka. And the in-depth fieldwork really is the case here. It's not just a cheap line in her bio. If you have read one of Sharon's articles, which have been published in prestigious journals such as the Korea Observer, International Journal of Sociology, Journal of Contemporary Asia, etc., you will no doubt have appreciated the lengthy first-person quotations that attest to the careful fieldwork underpinning the article, but that also then provide such humanization and interest and depth and nuance to Dr. Yoon's research on the ethnic and cultural resources that migrants exercise and the social and religious and economic networks that both connect, but then also provide tension within the diasporic communities that she studies. So without further ado, I invite you all to welcome Dr. Yoon today, and I hope you'll join with me and look forward to hearing the talk and learning more about her research. And just as a note of warning to the audience, this meeting is being recorded. So if you would not like to have a miniature version of your face recorded for posterity, feel free to turn off your cameras now. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Holly. I am so grateful to you and Professor Kim and Dr. Jin for inviting me. I am so excited to share my research with you. I also am an avid fan of Professor Kim's dog Yates, and I wanted to meet Yates one day. And so unfortunately, this is not the time, but hopefully when we return to the new normal, that will one day come true. So I'm going to share my screen. So my study takes place in the Koreatown in Beijing. And this is a picture of some Korean businesses in the heart of the Koreatown. And I'm going to start with giving you an overview of my talk. So first, I want to talk to you about the changing phases of migration and talk about the broader implications of my study. I'll talk about two different types of Koreans I met in the field and how I went about collecting my data. And then I want to give you some background information about the structural characteristics of Wangjing, which is where the Koreatown is located. And then I'll conclude the talk by giving you 3 takeaway points, my key findings in the field and what implications these findings have for the future of Korean studies. So first, in terms of the changing phases of migration. So throughout history, all over the world, migration has been used as a means to improve your life. And, you know, I totally felt that that was true for me as well as a second generation Korean American. You know, I watched my parents really struggle in the United States to make it. And there is this hope that by uprooting your lives and going to a new country, that you'll be able to make a better life either for yourselves or for your children. And this is true, you know, throughout history and all over the world. This is a picture of what we kind of envision the typical precarious migrant to be. A Mexican farmer, you know, who is working in the fields of California, or perhaps in the case of Korea, we might associate migrant precariousness with a Nepalese worker or an African factory worker in Seoul. But I argue that there's a change in how we need to understand migrant precariousness. Specifically, multinational corporations, as they're increasing their dominance in global migrants, I argue that migration, instead of providing people with more opportunities, has actually led to increasing levels of precariousness in a lot of different cases. In addition, I also argue that we need to rethink what the precarious migrant looks like. More and more, these precarious migrants are going to look like you and me. They are highly educated. They look like members of the middle class. They dress in nice clothes. They have the right degrees. And so the question that I had as I was kind of delving through the findings in my field was, why aren't we exposed to more diverse images of the precarious migrant? And, one of the reasons why is, our selection of where we decide to conduct these studies. The vast majority of studies on migration look at the direction from developing to advanced industrialized countries. This is a significant oversight because as global financial crises, as we're going through right now, is getting worse and worse, neoliberal restructuring has led to cleavages within the middle class in many wealthy nations. And increasing rates of unemployment and job security among members of the middle class have led to flows of migration from the opposite direction. So now more and more people from wealthier countries are going to developing countries like Thailand, Indonesia, China, and so forth, in an effort to hold on to their privileged lifestyles. In these new sites, I want us to become more aware of the more invisible ways that our behaviors, our economic outcomes, our perceptions of self are actually powerfully shaped by the ways that big corporations have in shaping local spaces and communities where we live and work. So my study is based in the Koreatown in Beijing, but Korean multinational companies known as the chaebol, so Samsung, LG, and so forth, they're not only going into Beijing, but also more and more to Southeast Asia. So one hotspot is Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Another hotspot is Bangkok, Thailand, which is also, starting to grow a booming Koreatown in Sukhumvit Plaza. And so I want us to take this case study and see how we can start to re-envision what it means to be a precarious Korean migrant overseas. So let me give you a taste of the types of people that I've met in the field. There are two major types of Korean migrants. The first type that I talk about in the introduction of my book is Mr. Park, who is a South Korean migrant. And on the surface, he has the trappings of middle-class status, right? He graduated from a prestigious university in Seoul. He had worked up his way in the corporate ladder at a major South Korean chaebol firm like Samsung. And by external measures, he had the pedigree and the career trajectory of a middle-class South Korean. Throughout the 1990s, middle-class lifestyles were somewhat stable, right? So the South Korean economy was booming rapidly, but this all came crashing down in 1997 with the Asian financial crisis. And so, Mr. Park is coming of age. He's in his late 30s, in the late 1990s, and he's kind of recalibrating what his future prospects are like in Seoul, right? He's watching his senior colleagues get laid off. A lot of them are encouraged to retire early. And all the while in China, there is buzz in business circles in Seoul that China is the next economic superpower. And indeed, in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. So when we look at life, not just for Mr. Park, but more broadly in South Korea, we enter this era where there's so much precariousness among the vast majority of the population in South Korea. Job stability post-1997 is few and far between, right? There are massive layoffs. There is no more lifetime employment. Instead, we have a deregulated labor market where income security is only true for the top 10% of those who are working as managers in major chaebol firms. And because of this lack of class mobility, if you are precarious, or if you are in an insecure position, the chances for you to move out of that position is few and far between. Why? There are two reasons. First is the mobility between an irregular and regular work is very rigid. If you start off with an irregular job, it's very, very difficult for you to move out of that position. Second, because all of these people who are getting laid off, who are, in part-time work, are going into entrepreneurship, the market for small businesses has become overly saturated. And so for entrepreneurs in South Korea, before 1997, it used to provide a way of upward mobility. It used to be a way for you to overcome obstacles in the labor market. After 1997, the picture changes very rapidly. The competition is extremely fierce, right? One in three people who are employed in South Korea are self-employed. And this is true even amongst the OECD. South Korea ranks the fourth highest of self-employed in the employed population. Because of the oversaturation in the self-employed markets, entrepreneurs in South Korea are not upwardly mobile. They're very vulnerable to downward mobility. The vast majority of them, 74%, are just one-person companies. They are highly concentrated in retail sectors, and their monthly incomes are only 60% of the average for regularly employed. Not only that, but there are extremely high rates of turnover, right? So the vast majority will fail within 3 years. And so this is the climate in post-1997 Asian financial crisis that Mr. Park finds himself in. In the early 2000s then, we have thousands and thousands of South Koreans like Mr. Park entering into Beijing and starting small businesses. And this is a picture of some small retail chains in Wangjing. What was really disheartening for me, though, was I found that the vast majority of the people fail, right? So according to the Chinese Academy for Social Sciences, about 1 in 3 South Korean entrepreneurs left Beijing in 2009 due to economic hardship. And, envisioning, their legal statuses, right? They're coming in as tourists. They have no access to state aid in terms of welfare. Because they're undocumented, they have no access to healthcare or hospital care or pensions. And so in a lot of ways, their precariousness is even more accentuated in Beijing. A lot of them, left to go to more remote areas. Some of them went back to South Korea to live with their families. And a lot of them you just lost contact with. And so these are the stories that I was surrounded with when I was in Beijing. So I want to tell you a different story then, a very contrastive story of a different type of Korean that also lived in Wangjing. And Mr. Shin is a typical Korean Chinese, 3rd and 4th generation Korean Chinese migrant who is known to occupy the category of the nouveau riche. So Mr. Shin's grandparents migrated across the Manchurian border into what is now known as the Dongbei region or northeastern China. For many generations throughout the Mao Zedong era, they lived tilling the rice paddies within agricultural communes that were somewhat isolated from the surrounding Han Chinese society, right? In these communes, they spoke Korean, they went to Korean schools, they had small civic organizations that supported the Korean community. And so it was a very tightly knit, quaint Korean village that he lived in all throughout his life. In 1992, when the channels of trade and commerce opened between Seoul and Beijing, thousands and thousands of Korean Chinese, they left these quaint villages and they started migrating to Seoul to find jobs in the 3D sector. But a lot of them also migrated to major cities within China, such as Beijing and Shanghai. And many of these migrants, they found work as translators, as bilingual interpreters for South Korean firms. So for the case of Mr. Shin, initially he found a job in Beijing as a translator for South Korean expats or South Korean Chujewan at Samsung headquarters. And he was periodically sent back to Seoul for training. But after many, many years of trying to get promoted in Samsung, he kind of hit a glass ceiling, and he found a lot of his South Korean colleagues who came in with him actually very rapidly moving up the corporate ladder. But for him, by virtue of being Korean Chinese, while his starting salary was great, he kind of hit a wall. And so eventually he leaves Samsung and starts his own business in the Korean Enclave as a small business catering to these wealthy South Korean expats. The day that we met for our interview, he was in his mid-30s. And he was extremely successful in terms of his material kind of wealth, right? So he had already purchased several real estate properties in addition to his home in the outskirts of Beijing. He drove around this Audi. He was the owner of a popular retail chain that had branches even outside of the enclave. And more, I found a lot of Korean Chinese migrants who are like Mr. Shin, who are very successful in terms of their material wealth because they were able to take advantage of the transnational resources that flowed inside the enclave economy. What I want us to pay attention to, though, was that even though Mr. Shin's story is one of agency and, in a sense, resistance against the powers of corporate interests, I was puzzled to find that Mr. Shin, in many ways, he seemed to regret his decision to leave his village. He said that in his village, maybe they weren't very rich, but he was happy. He had a home, he felt a sense of belonging. But in Beijing, he felt like the South Koreans treated him as a second-class citizen. And this angst that he felt, I initially actually dismissed. I was more prone to point to his wealth. I said, look at how much you've accomplished, right? You live in this lavish home, you drive around this fancy car. Your life in so many ways has improved since you moved out of this agricultural commune. Aren't you so glad, right, at the types of opportunities that you have here in Beijing? And, he really struggled with this. The more that I started to kind of grapple with these findings, the more I saw that for South Koreans and Korean Chinese, they had a very hostile tie with each other because they were constantly competing with each other in terms of trying to gain access to these wealthy South Korean expats. The South Korean entrepreneurs, they used their influence over moral resources as quote unquote pure Koreans, whereas the Korean Chinese use their culturally hybrid backgrounds to expand their material wealth. And while they fought over their right to belong or their right to middle-class status, many failed to see the larger structures of how inequality was perpetuated in spaces where they lived. And they saw the global elite and the global middle class, who were the chaebol, their dominance, the chaebol's dominance, was largely kind of normalized and uncontested. Ultimately, my book argues that neither the South Korean entrepreneurs nor the Korean Chinese migrants were able to achieve the middle-class dream in Wangjing, particularly during times of economic crises. Migrants who venture overseas to open small businesses have taken fate into their own hands. They arrive not only with material dreams of wealth, but also hopes of acquiring the immaterial benefits the feelings of belonging, inclusion, and legitimacy that's associated with the middle class. And my book seeks to demonstrate how this system of stratification and inequality within the ethnic enclave is perpetuated. So I want to give you just a brief taste of how I collected my data. So my data collection was divided along 3 phases. In the first phase, I taught as an English instructor at UST, which is a very prominent university in Yanbian, which is in these kind of traditional Korean enclaves in the rural Northeast. And then in phase 2, I moved to Beijing and I conducted 4 months of field research. I conducted a large survey of Korean Chinese of 418 migrants, as well as 40 interviews with these Korean Chinese ethnic minorities. And then the following year, I came in and I did a survey of the South Korean population, as well as a series of interviews with South Korean immigrants and Han Chinese in the enclave. But at the heart of my research is participant observation. And I wanted to understand how global capital, or how these large South Korean multinational firms were really structuring the spaces of interaction in small businesses within the enclave, the residential spaces, the neighborhoods in which the Koreans lived and worked, the types of civic organizations like the churches, as well as the chaebol. I can go more into the ways that I conducted my research in the Q&A if you have any questions. But let me give you a brief taste of what the enclave is like. So Wangjing, which is the district in Beijing where the Korean enclave is located, is right smack in the middle between the city center of Beijing and the international airport. It is an upwardly mobile residential neighborhood where massive real estate projects happen within a very short span of time. So whenever I rode the taxis within Wangjing, all of the drivers, they would tell me how, only within 5 years ago, all of these beautiful roads and high-rise buildings were not there. In the late 1990s, Wangjing was actually an empty wasteland. There was nothing there, right? And then within a span of 10 years, Wangjing actually became one of the largest Korean communities in China, as well as in the world, right? In 2010, when I was conducting research, 150,000 Korean migrants lived in Wangjing. There are very specific pockets within Wangjing where there's even a more concentrated cluster of Korean migrants. This is a picture of Wangjing Shincheong, which is at the heart of the enclave. And a lot of Koreans were concentrated within these residential areas. And you can hear Koreans spoken very regularly walking within these complexes, right? And so this is a sign within the apartment complex of Wangjing Shincheong, and you can just imagine the degree of a concentration of Korean residents there were, given all of these signs, right, that were also catering to the booming Korean population. So a lot of these Korean enclaves that were sprouting around urban areas in China were replacing the agricultural communes that I talked about in Mr. Shin's case study, that are kind of concentrated in these districts of Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning. From these areas, right, they started emptying out of these Korean rural enclaves and going into Beijing. And so there are 2 different types of waves of migration that are entering into the Korean enclave. The first is the Korean Chinese rural migrant. And then the second type are the South Korean entrepreneurs and chaebol executives that are trying to build businesses and penetrate Chinese markets. What I was so amazed at, though, was, as a second generation Korean American, I grew up in in Fort Lee and in Flushing, we would go to get our weekly supply of Korean food in these Koreatowns. And I remember seeing the Koreatowns as very rundown areas, right, where there was a mix of different ethnicities. They weren't necessarily the most wealthy areas, but Wangjing was very, very different. You know, not only were there massive high-rise apartment buildings, but you know, multinational corporations from all over the world, including Western companies like Motorola and Daimler, were setting up regional headquarters in Wangjing. And this is because Wangjing is a special project. It's the brainchild of the Chinese government in order to attract foreign direct investment. To give you an example, Wangjing Science and Technology Park in 2005 hosted 228 foreign enterprises, which accounted for a total of 256 million US dollars. But more than these Western companies or these Japanese companies that were penetrating Wangjing, there was, by and large, a lot of South Korean chaebol companies in particular. And this is because South Korean companies were on the verge of collapse in the late 1990s. And they saw foreign expansion and in particular, partnership with China that wanted to attract foreign direct investment as a really important strategy in order to survive. If you think back to the Asian financial crisis, right, financial institutions in South Korea and chaebol companies that were seen as invincible, they started to be on the brink of collapse, right? So they were really pumping in a lot of capital into Beijing. And so we can start to see, right, the dramatic incline of South Korean direct investment between 1997 and then in 2001, which is where China enters the WTO, and then it starts to skyrocket. China in the past 10 years is the most important trading partner for South Korea. In 2013, when I left the field, South Korean FDI surpassed 5 billion US dollars, accounting for 20% of total FDI from the country. And the number of South Korean visitors, a lot of them ended up being entrepreneurs, started to skyrocket as well, right? During the same period, during 2002 and onwards, when I started to conduct my field research. So for me, I thought, you know, if Korean immigrant entrepreneurs of my childhood were able to gain economic stability by building these very humble nail salons and dry cleaners in the rundown neighborhoods of Flushing, New York and Fort Lee, why wasn't Wangjing able to present Korean migrants who lived there with many more abundant resources from South Korea? Why weren't they able to move up the class ladder and have a stable life? I want to just summarize 3 main takeaway points from my book. The first is that the chaebol has produced inequality in terms of income and economic inequality, not only within the domestic sphere, but we need to look at stratification within a global sphere. And we can see that because the chaebol produces stratified flows of Korean labor into Wangjing. Right, so on the top of the hierarchy, you have the Chujewan, who are the South Korean expats. These are the chaebol managers, the executives, who are planted in Wangjing as upper level managers, and they live in exclusive gated communities. They live in exclusive gated communities in Gangnam, right? And they continue to have this very lavish lifestyle in Wangjing as well. In a lot of ways, I saw that the extent of their privilege was even more accentuated in Wangjing. Why? because as an incentive to go overseas, not only do they have double the incomes that they had received in Seoul, but they had a variety of fringe benefits, right? They had stipends for their housing, and so they were able to live in much more luxurious apartments. They had educational stipends for their children, and they sent their kids to exclusive, or what they called A-level international schools, in hopes of sending their children to an Ivy League college in the outskirts of Beijing. Not only that, but they also had stipends for, someone, a housekeeper. They also had personal drivers, right? And so the inequality between the South Korean grassroots migrants, who were by and large downwardly mobile, and the South Korean expats, who had even more lavish lifestyles, were more exaggerated in Wangjing. And so I want us to think about the global scale of inequality perpetuated by the chaebol. At the bottom of the social strata within the enclave are Korean Chinese minorities. And we can see how the chaebol has, in a sense, exploited the very best, the creme de la creme of the highly educated Korean Chinese. So these are Korean Chinese who are going into Beijing to study at the most prestigious universities, whether it be Peking University or Tsinghua University. And yet they, like Mr. Shin, hit a glass ceiling by virtue of being Korean Chinese. Their skills are not valued, right? And so many of these leave the sphere of work within the chaebol, and they start their own entrepreneurial enterprises. But as we find, even though they experience wealth, because their wealth is delegitimized, they are still seen as second-class citizens. The second takeaway point that I want us to remember is to look beyond income inequality, to look beyond the economic statuses of this hierarchical infrastructure, right? The chaebol actually reproduces inequality in terms of their moral and cultural resources, in terms of social status that extends far beyond material wealth. And we can see this in terms of their roles as cultural institutions reproducing social strata within Wangjing as well. We can see this by how South Korean media portrayals that are occurring in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis continue to shape interactions in everyday life in Wangjing as well. So when the Asian financial crisis hit South Korea, news outlets portrayed people like Mr. Park, who are South Korean entrepreneurs, as faultless victims who were deserving of public sympathy and state aid. Yes, they were, precarious, but in a sense, they were also moral, right? They are also seen as people who were precarious, not out of their own faults for trying. And so the chaebol during this time period mobilized age-old ideologies of good wife, wise mother to encourage women in South Korea to soothe their husbands' egos, as seen in, for instance, Chae Il-bang's Boost Your Husband's Spirit campaign in the post-1990s era. Television soap operas and popular talk shows also offered advice as to how wives could support their husbands during this period of financial hardship. But while South Korean men were at the forefront of national sympathy, media portrayals of Korean Chinese minorities in the late 1990s were colored similarly by moralistic narratives of greed and deceit. For instance, Korean Chinese women who wed South Korean farmers in the same period were depicted as seductresses who used their feminine wiles to swindle innocent South Korean farmer bachelors. Korean Chinese men who provided their manual labor in Seoul were hyper-masculinized as violent criminals who went to extreme lengths to gain economic mobility, to gain wealth by, there were these sensationalized stories of Korean Chinese gangs, right, who are extremely violent. One story was how one gang member had dismembered all of the limbs of a South Korean because he was unable to repay his loans, right? And so these images of Korean Chinese as extremely violent, as going to whatever length possible in order to gain wealth, was really popularized in the late 1990s in South Korea. And so because of the strong transnational ties between Seoul and Beijing, these South Korean media portrayals in everyday life colored the perceptions of how people interpreted economic outcomes in Gwangjing. Many South Korean entrepreneurs in the Enclave, including Mr. Park, believed that they were downwardly mobile, that they failed because Korean Chinese managers fooled them, that they were victims of Korean Chinese con artists. I was told stories of how so-and-so hired a Korean Chinese manager who later turned out to be a con artist because he stole his ideas and resources from his South Korean boss to grow a more successful and similar business in Gwangjing. When I tried to grapple with how to understand why this was happening, I started to look at Irving Goffman, the sociologist who coined this idea of status anxiety, right? So people who are at the brink of downward mobility, they cling to whatever resources they have possible in order to cling on to their statuses as members of the middle class. And so for the South Koreans, the only kind of resources they had was their connection to being South Korean, or their connection to being pure Koreans as opposed to the Korean Chinese. He argues that during times of instability, these status symbols work to retard the rise of the nouveau riche. And we start to see how this also happens for the Korean Chinese. And the Korean Chinese, unbeknownst themselves, they reify these dynamics because, I started to see how a lot of them engaged in conspicuous consumption, right? They started to flaunt their wealth. They tried to purchase, symbols of their status, right? By brand name handbags, by dressing in really nice clothes, by driving luxurious sports cars. And some of them even tried to outwardly pass as South Korean by masking their Korean Chinese accents. Because they had no other resources, I believe, to prove their self-esteem as Korean Chinese minorities, right? So as marginalized minorities, they lacked the moral and cultural resources to construct an alternative narrative of their identities that invoked a sense of pride and self-esteem outside of the confines of their in-group. The final and third idea that I want you guys to take away with is just how important spaces are in reifying and normalizing inequality and stratification in everyday life. And in my book, I try to show how global capital plays a really important role in normalizing these practices. So Bourdieu reminds us of how preconceived notions like stereotypes and class identities, they become real only when we embody these ideas in practice. And what I mean by practice is in lived experiences of everyday life, right? So the process of how our ideas become embodied is really important in understanding how social realities become embraced as quote unquote real. Place in this way sustains difference and hierarchy, both by routinizing daily rounds in ways that exclude and separate categories of people, and by embodying in visible and tangible ways the cultural meanings that are ascribed to them. So my book looks at how global capitalism, or the chaebol, they structure residential neighborhoods, and I show how the spaces of residential life are actually spatially segregated according to expats, the Chujewan, the South Korean grassroots migrants, and the Korean Chinese migrants. Another chapter looks at how the space of the chaebol in and of itself is also stratified in the terms of space and status, and how it reifies and legitimizes these hierarchies. I also look at the church, a Korean Chinese underground church, and a state-sanctioned church, and how these civic organizations also reproduce these scripts of hierarchy and inequality. So what types of theoretical implications does this have for Korean studies? So very briefly, right, in the past 10 years, there has been an outpouring of research on the Korean diaspora. And a lot of this is because after the Overseas Korean Act in 1999, there has been thousands and thousands of Korean diaspora from the former Soviet Union, from China, North Korea, and Japan that are re-entering South Korea because the legal restrictions for them have been relaxed. But the vast majority of research, I think, actually looks at how the state is really powerful in defining how people understand their belonging and their identities as Koreans. And I want us to actually look at an alternative perspective of looking at not the state, but how corporate interests, and in particular the chaebol, really shapes the ways, by shaping labor relations, can shape the ways that diaspora Koreans understand belonging and legitimacy. The second takeaway point in terms of Korean studies is I want us to also get away from this idea of deterritorialization, right? So because of these massive waves of transnational migration amongst these diaspora Koreans, a lot of scholars are saying that space no longer matters, right? In globalization and in this era of the internet, it's more about these more conceptualized spheres of interactions that we want to think about in terms of national community. But what I want us to consider is that in this global era, we need to focus even more on how physical spaces of interactions of where migrants live and work have changed. And by becoming aware of these factors, I think we need to carefully rethink the ways in which we approach the field and conduct research. Thank you for your time. So I can take some questions, or I think Dr. Jin, are you going to provide some?
I think in the interest of time, I will give just brief comments, and then questions. So the reason why I found your book fascinating is that I'm also a product of immigration, because my family also immigrated to China, albeit Hong Kong. And although we went there in 1994, we also experienced firsthand how IMF financial crisis had impact on business people like my father. Although my father was fine, but his friends, some of them actually returned back to Korea at that time because they could not survive. And when you described the role of civic groups such as church, again, that's very relevant for me because I also attended Korean church in Hong Kong, but only briefly because I really got sick and tired of its materialism and very right-wing views and other views that I found disturbing. And you mentioned conspicuous consumption. I think that's another characteristic that I found in Koreatown of Hong Kong, in Chim Sa Choi. Yeah. So and then you also discussed, for example, this role of chaebol and privileges of expats. Again, the same thing, similar developments in Hong Kong as well. And I guess when you look at this, I guess another reason why I found your book very easily to identify is the structure is very easy to follow. for readers who are interested in the patterns of migration. So for example, one chapter you deal with the relationship between gender and chaebol. So for example, feminization of Korean Chinese workers and how the paradoxical appearance of paradoxes of appearance and reality. So for instance, we would think that both Korean Chinese and South Koreans can identify themselves well because they both speak Korean. But of course, in reality, that was not the case. And I wonder if it's just down to cultural reasons, though, because as you know, South Korea is still a very anti-communist country. And to this date, despite normalizing relations with China, many South Koreans still hold very anti-China views, especially my parents' generation. So I guess that's something that maybe you could comment on. And moving on to questions, the first question is that in introduction, you touched on Benedict Anderson's imagined community and its impact on transnational enclave. And I suppose I agree with you on that, but then because that China and Korea is very close, I wonder whether Anderson's notion of imagined community can is it really that be applied as it is in the case of Wang Jing? Because although people like me, I experienced kind of identity crisis because I went there when I was very young. But at the same time, I felt like Korean at times, but I also felt like nobody in Hong Kong. And I still have this identity even now. And the second question is that perhaps I wonder if you have any further interest in expanding your research by comparing Wangjing and, say, Shinokubo in Tokyo or Osaka Chinese community. And the third one is, I know that you left it for the future researchers, but just out of curiosity, how do you see that this cleavage between middle class and the future of politics and social movements within migrant communities, including, for example, places like Wangjing, where I think perhaps it's a bit different from, say, other migrant communities in New York or Tokyo, considering much more conservative and some might say more restricted political atmosphere, especially under the current government of Xi Jinping. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Holly. Should I just respond or how should we do this?
Yeah, I think if you respond there, we will be able to take questions in the chat, but none have emerged yet. So you can respond to Sangpo's questions and then hopefully, yeah, anyone else who has a question, please put your name or the question in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with, and then we'll get to you in turn.
Okay. Dr. Jin, I am so happy to hear that you grew up in Hong Kong. Like that makes me feel like, I don't know, you know, as a writer, right? That's a dream to make a connection that's personal with the person who's reading it. So it's just so gratifying to me to hear that you connected with the stories of the book. So you have 4 questions, right? And the first is about feminization of workers in the chaebol and whether their discrimination was primarily cultural or whether there are some kind of anti-communist or other reasons why South Koreans might have discriminated against them. So there are, I think, 2 ways that you can look at this. One way that you can look at this is seeing how the Korean Chinese are discriminated against in mainstream society in South Korea. And one argument that I have is that, you know, these media portrayals that are very derogatory are constantly kind of affecting the atmosphere even within the chaebol because these expats are going back and forth all the time. Not only are they just, you know, a lot of times there's like high rates of turnover because their stints are so short. And so each new type of director that's coming in most of his mindset and his perceptions are already shaped by what he's seeing on TV in South Korea, right? So one aspect is, I don't know more about, it's more than anti-communism. It's more about these like very dramatic portrayals of Korean Chinese in movies, like, recent movies like Missing, or I don't know the titles, but that they portray the Korean Chinese as very kind of con artists and violent, and this kind of affects the broader ambiance. When you look specifically at the Chaebol, though, I think their discrimination is mostly from their skills, right? So in a sense, they're put on a different track, and they're valued because of their cultural skills. They're valued because they're seen as people who can ease cultural conflicts between South Koreans and the Han Chinese society. And that's kind of seen as a feminine skill, right? And because it's seen as a feminine skill, it's not valued as much as a technical skill as like accounting or in IT or so on, right? And so in this sense, I do think it is more of the ways that culture is feminized and interpersonal skills are seen as endemic to the Korean Chinese. Even though they have a lot of skills, they're not trained to have these technical skills. And so that really stunts their mobility. In terms of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, your feeling of not feeling here, neither here nor there. And that is a feeling that I also feel, right? And that is actually, if you delve the deepest, in the deepest core of why I wanted to do this study, right? As a Korean American, I have always struggled with this feeling of not belonging, of being an Asian American in a hyphenated American in the United States. And when I went to Korea, everyone would pick at like all of these grammatical errors in my Korean, and I never felt like I was fully accepted in any country, right? And so I think because I wanted to understand that was why I conducted this study. And I think that a lot of the Korean Chinese also feel that way, right? And so what I'm arguing is that this idea of being middle class is not just material, but it's also an emotional privilege. It's an emotional privilege to feel like you are legitimate and that you belong and that your being is as a full member of the society, right? And so I wanted to understand the linkages of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities and the more kind of economic implications that might have. In terms of kind of comparing across these new types of Korean enclaves, right? So actually my new project looks at Korean diaspora in Japan. I don't know if you know already, maybe you've seen, but so I conducted field research in Osaka and in Shinokubo. They're very different, right? One major difference is that in Japan, they're post-colonial. And so the setting, for instance, in Osaka that takes place is, during like the pre-colonial slums where a lot of the Zainichi worked in these slave-like conditions in these squatter settlements, and how these settlements have now been affected by newcomers, right? And so there are similar tensions, but I don't, I definitely think the narrative in Japan is more prominently shaped by the political relationship between the Zainichi and Japan rather than these newcomers, although you do find a lot of newcomers in Shinokubo, right? But again, right, it's much more, I think the dynamics are a little bit more complicated, although you do have multinational companies there as well. Finally, in terms of political mobilization, so, that is actually what my next project looks at. I want to see how the Zainichi are able to mobilize within the resources of the enclave in order to fight for legal reform. Again, in the case of Wangjing, I think political mobilization would be very difficult. Because they're not aware, right? They're constantly fighting against each other, right? The Korean Chinese are saying it's the South Koreans' fault. The South Koreans are saying it's the Korean Chinese fault. And they're so like so enmeshed in this inter-ethnic conflict that they forget to see that actually the source of their problems is the chaebol, and it's the global middle class, and their elite status, their privilege is so normalized that you would have to break that in order to have political mobilization.
Right. Yeah. Divide and conquer. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes.
That's great. Well, we've got lots of questions rolling in now too. So I think we can start to work through those, and hopefully we'll get time to hear from everybody. Frank, your question is first. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I first like to comment that the prosperity of Wang Jing is definitely, we should pay the credit to the Chinese Korean or Korean Chinese people. I just did a little research, and just this month, the house price of the Wang Jing is about $10,000 a meter square. And if you compare to late 1990s or early 2000, it's only $500 to $1,000 US per meter square. That means if you arrived on the right time, it's not so difficult to make you a multi-millionaire in terms of, you know, pound or sterling or dollars. I don't question the middle class, you know, in this group of people in Beijing, and you mentioned. But the thing is, my question is, if we just change the perspective a little bit, is that really appropriate to say Beijing as a global capital? Like, you know, these people, they're doing well in Beijing, despite they're doing well in Beijing, but there are already, we see so many doors shutted for them. Like the government-controlled, you know, enterprises, the government, and they don't have the political representatives. And one good example is, yeah, we don't compare to Shin-Okubo in Japan, but if we look at some Japanese Koreans, they have some tycoons in different industries, which we don't see them in Beijing. So what you have been describing is about, yeah, most of them are entrepreneurs because there are not other choices for them to be. So it's okay to be entrepreneur, to be doing well, but I haven't really seen any kind of Korean name. We're not talking about the Sun Zhongyi, the SoftBank, that level, but even the on the rich list level or the political tycoon influence, having the big influence, you know, the Korean people in Beijing, we don't see any of them. So that's, maybe I would say that's a good local community, some kind of soft growing, like in Wanjing district, you know, where the party doesn't really want to pay too much attention. So what they have been growing as, it's a kind of natural growing order. Maybe in a semi-global capital, something like that. That's just my comment. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Should I just comment directly or? Okay. Yeah, I actually agree with you. In terms of global capitalism, what I was trying to refer to was more in terms of multinational corporations. So the dominance of these multinational corporations, I argue, is structuring ethnic communities. But I agree with you in the sense that real estate inflation in Beijing is just incomparable, right? From other scenarios, especially in this time period of from early 2000s to right now. And because I haven't gone back into the field since 2013, I don't know what the implications that would have on the South Koreans and the Korean Chinese. I would assume that their downward mobility and their precariousness has become even more accentuated. And I'd also assume that I saw limited wealth for the Korean Chinese, but I wonder, you know, with the inflation of real estate, one big problem was the expats, they could afford to live there and they could afford to buy property and to send their children to these schools. But everyone else, you know, because of the real estate inflation, they couldn't afford rent anymore, right? And that was also a very big part of their downward mobility. And so I would wonder, what would happen to the Korean Chinese in their limited success? Was it able to be sustained over this period of inflation? And I honestly don't know, but I feel very apprehensive, right, about what might have happened. And so in a sense, it actually even accentuates the gap between the fractured middle class and then the global middle class.
Xiaoying, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you for your insightful and helpful presentation, especially for my research and also my personal background, because I am a Korean Chinese. And I am very, very glad to hear your research. And I've been waiting for buying your book, but I failed. Actually, I studied in Beijing for 4 years, and Wangjing is actually my first place to go to taste my family food. And I could fully have empathy on that the concept that status anxiety that you mentioned. For example, Korean Chinese have to grasp all the resources they have, they could grab, or for example, mimicry their accent or work for Korean entrepreneurs. And because I am just a newly started PhD student, and I am also doing migration related topic, so I have more interest in your data collection. So my questions would be, the first one is, what was the difficulty in doing your field work, in 1 year or for a long time? And could you also please explain concretely on how you did your participate observation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xiaoying. I really hope you buy the book, because I also talk about some of my close friends who I met in the Enclave, who are also Korean Chinese, and I talk about their experiences through their eyes. So I really hope you get to share that with me. So in terms of data collection, it was really hard. Especially for the Korean Chinese component. The South Koreans were like, yay, welcome to our community. But then for the Korean Chinese part, because I was seen as a South Korean, they wouldn't really talk to me. And I tried so hard to make friends. And it was like an ice barrier, right? So what I ended up doing was, after many failed attempts, I became involved in a church, and I thought, the church is where, because I'm also a pastor's daughter, right? So I'm very comfortable in the church, and I was like, I can help, I can volunteer, I can be a useful person, and by being useful, maybe they will reciprocate and be friends with me, right? So I tried to do that, and still, I would sit and no one would talk to me, and then I started thinking, what should I do? I was, in my PhD too, and I thought, if I can't do this research, I can't graduate. If I can't graduate, what is it? My past 10 years, what is that for? And then one morning, I woke up because I couldn't sleep. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. I went to 새벽 기도, which is morning prayer in English. And I went to 새벽 기도 in the Korean church, in the Korean Chinese underground church. And when I went, everyone was so surprised. They were like, why are you here? Welcome, but why are you here? And, I seemed really tired and distressed. And I went there, and then during the time where they turn off the lights and there's hymns playing and we were praying, I was so tired and so stressed out, and I didn't know how I would finish my PhD, that I just started crying. And then people heard me cry, and then they started to feel really bad for me. And then for the first time, they were like, oh, come here, you poor Hakseng, you know, come here. And then that was how they opened their hearts to me. So it took like 4 months, many efforts of trying. And then finally, it was because I made myself vulnerable and I showed them that I really cared, right? And it wasn't just about trying to finish my PhD, but I really wanted to understand them. And then they finally trusted me. And then after that, it was amazing. Like all of these doors, they started opening. And then they started inviting me to their homes. You know, I started working. I found this Unni, and then I worked for her company. And through her, I also met other entrepreneurs. And then I hired a Korean Chinese research assistant. And then together, we went around to all of these businesses and passing out, they don't do this anymore, but like we had these paper survey questionnaires and we would pass out these survey questionnaires together. And then through those survey questionnaires, we also got to interview people, right? So it was definitely an emotionally exhausting and difficult experience, but I am so glad, you know, that I went through all that I did, because it made me, when I was sitting down to write it, you know, that emotional connection that I had with the people there really helped me understand what kind of story I wanted to tell.
Yejin, I think you're up now.
Yep, thank you so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. I am also interested in like sharing. I want to do ethnography for fieldwork. So I have similar question about method and findings. Mine is about like language accent changes in Korean diaspora, so it's kind of overlap. So I wanted to ask about the research, survey. Did you speak Korean to them? And and also you mentioned about, so I read about your paper on Korean observers published in 2017. It was mentioning about survey for Korean Chinese were kind of lower quality because of the misunderstanding or something. So I was wondering, how did you cope with that? And also another question is about the church. So you had a research from the church, and I was wondering if there was any religious ideology that you found from your findings, because they have the common sense of being Korean ethnic, but also maybe same religion. So maybe there's different findings you found. And the last thing is about, did you observe any class changes when people like Korean Chinese and South Korean and Han Chinese working in the same company, then this Korean Chinese becoming a translator and becoming in a middle manager position, then it's quite different from what Chinese society, or the position they might have in Chinese society. So did you observe any changes that like Han Chinese feeling more neglected in that society? And also, is that reflect? Sorry, one last question is about, so I was living in Malaysia and I found similar findings that in Chinese context. So I was working as an expat, so maybe it's more of Mr. Shin's side. And I was wondering, what do you think the reason that the people often dismiss not seeing this bigger structure that constrain them from success and just fighting within their like ethnicity? Why do you think that's the reason? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yejin. Great questions, right? So in terms of the practical questions first, surveys, accents. Yeah, accents were so important, right? So in the beginning, I did all of the surveys and the interviews by myself, but then I found that they wouldn't talk to me or they wouldn't answer the surveys. So that's why I hired a Korean Chinese research assistant. I hired actually a team of them from Peking University and Minzu University. And so I made them go out and dispatch. And when I went with them, I wouldn't say anything. So there was more a level of affinity there. And so accents was also really important. At a certain level though, you know, you do want to be transparent. You don't want to mimic the Korean Chinese accent. If you're not Korean Chinese, that's kind of unethical. So what I did for a lot of my interviews was I did it together with my Korean Chinese research assistant. And she kind of provided legitimacy in the sense that, you know, because we had a really close relationship, they saw, oh, if she trusts her, then maybe she's okay, right? So I did it in that way. The sampling population for the Korean Chinese was lower quality. That's very true. I think the South Koreans, they knew what surveys were. So when I gave them the survey, they knew how to answer all of the boxes. But a lot of the Korean Chinese, especially those who are of a lower educated background, like, you know, some of them only had gone to elementary school, especially the older people. So some of them didn't know how to fill it out. And so my research assistants would go one by one and try to help them fill it out. But sometimes we did it at the church, right? Where after worship ceremony, we would kind of hand out the surveys, and we didn't have enough people to help them. So that was why there was lower quality. Because of these difficulties, it's really hard for an original survey to be by itself a strong measure or indicator of your data. You need to be able to supplement it by all these other findings and together come up with some kind of composite picture of what you're finding. So it's not perfect, and you need to be clear about why it's not perfect. But together, it still provides you a bigger view than if I just did the interviews themselves. In terms of religious ideology, you know, I think the Christianity that both the Korean Chinese and the South Koreans believed were very similar. So I don't know if there were any differences on that front. In terms of the hierarchy within the workplace, you have South Koreans, Korean Chinese middle level managers, and then Han Chinese who are at the lowest rungs, which is different from South Korea, right? Where the Korean Chinese were often kind of the low wage workers. And this is actually part of the reason why the Korean Chinese have some advantage in becoming successful, I think, because they're able to shape the ways that things are translated. And that's actually a really important source of power. You can translate the same thing in a lot of different ways to benefit a certain party. And they were able to do that really well. And I think that eventually that became a source of their power. And in terms of Malaysia, I would actually really want you to do a study on Malaysia. That'd be awesome, right? And see like what you're finding in the Koreatowns there, because so much of our research is on New York or Japan or LA. These Southeast Asian communities where the Koreatowns are really thriving, there's not a lot done on those areas. So you found very similar experiences in the chaebol firm as an expat worker. And why do they dismiss bigger structures? Why don't they see what's going on? In the chaebol, the Korean Chinese, they all knew that they were not going to get promoted, that they weren't valued because they were Korean Chinese. So in some ways it was visible, but they were powerless in trying to change that because of the way that the workplace was already structured. You know, they were put on a different track. They were saying, okay, you guys are translators. You guys are, you know, South Koreans are put on a different track. So they're given all of these training. And if you didn't have that training, you couldn't move up the ladder. And so it was just the way that the company was structured that perpetuated this inequality. Does that answer your questions? Great.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
We have another long list of questions from Matteo Fumagalli. Are you here, Matteo, to ask? Or would you?
Yep, I'm here.
Great.
Thanks. Hi, Holly. Thanks, Sharon. That was a great talk. Sorry for the long message in the chat. I suppose that the bigger picture would be whether you could say something about how shared, if they were shared, the spaces, the networks, and institutions that different different Korean communities in Beijing were relying on. And in the chat, I mentioned the housing sector. So, okay, that's Koreatown, fine. But what about the individual housings? Were they shared among the South Koreans and the Korean Chinese? And obviously, there's the elephant in the room. So there's with 100,000 North Koreans living abroad, surely there must be a few hundreds at least of them in Beijing. And where would they live in town? And what areas of interactions were there? And then with regard to the broader institutions, now I've done work on Koreans in the former Soviet Union, where the cultural associations would be both the areas where Koreans are supposed to come together, but actually they fall apart along generational lines. And I was thinking about the churches, so I wonder whether you could see any areas of overlaps in terms of the associations, the organizations, the networks that the two sets of Koreans were drawing on and attending. Thank you.
Can I ask you to clarify what you mean by the individual housing aspect?
The actual housing blocks. So, I mean, were immigrant Koreans from South Korea sharing the same spaces in the neighborhood, or were different buildings assigned to different Koreans coming from different places? I mean, you would have some of this in some areas of outside of Seoul, say Incheon, Asan, where some government housing is assigned to Koreans coming from certain parts of the former Soviet Union. So I wonder whether there's just it doesn't really matter where Koreans come from, but they would live in the same housing block, for example.
Yeah, definitely. I found that the enclave was actually really clearly spatially segregated according to three groups of Koreans. So the expats, they lived in one of two luxury apartments. So if you lived in that luxury apartment, it was clear that you were some kind of executive at like Samsung or so on, right? And that's primarily because no one else could afford to live there. So and then in terms of the South Korean grassroots migrants, they would start moving into Shincheon, which was the picture that I showed you. And then a lot of them would lose their businesses, or they would have to downsize, and they would also move to another district next to Shincheon, and then they would even have to downsize even further, and then they would kind of disappear, right? And we wouldn't hear about where they went. The Korean Chinese, actually, they even those who are wealthy, they wouldn't live in Shincheon. Not a lot of people would live in Shincheon or these luxury high rises. They had their own kind of pocket within the enclave, and that started off when Hyundai Motors in, I think, 1999. They used that apartment complex as a dormitory, and they put in all of these Korean Chinese factory workers in the apartment complex in like bunk beds. So there would be like 6 Korean Chinese who are living in like one kind of apartment housing unit, sharing these spaces. And then that actually became marked as a Korean Chinese side of the enclave. And you would have like Yanbian cold noodles or lamb skewers, Korean Chinese type of foods, and boutiques that are sprouting around that area. And then other people who are more wealthy, because they feel comfortable there, would start to live in this area, right? And so that area was marked as Korean Chinese. And then if you were a South Korean, you had no business going there, right? It was this, why would you live there, was the kind of image that I got. So, when a Korean person asks you where you live, you're kind of marking yourself already, like which category you belong to. In terms of networks, there was a lot of efforts from the Korean Chinese underground church to make themselves financially independent from South Korean missionaries. So in the beginning, we used to get a lot of money from South Korean missionaries and these mega churches, but that those monies came with ties, right? With strings attached. And you know, these missionaries would say, I want you to do this, I want you to do that, you shouldn't have this Bible study. And they didn't want to be controlled anymore. And so they cut off ties and they tried to do their own thing. But they also saw part of their mission to help South Koreans kind of evangelize to local Chinese. And so we would have like groups of Chinese come into our church and go on these short-term mission trips. But there was a lot of hostility, right? So again, as a South Korean, someone who was marked as South Korean, when I went to that Korean Chinese church, they were like, why are you here? Like, explain your presence to us, right? And I would try to say, no, I am Korean American. I'm a diaspora Korean like you, but it wouldn't go through, right? So that is the extent to which these lines between dividing the civic organizations were so stark and clear.
Great, thank you.
That's great. We have 2 more questions and probably just enough time to answer them. So I'm going to ask Hyojin Park and then Roland Gan to ask you questions one after the other, and then Sharon can hopefully combine a response while still not going over that time limit. So over to you guys.
I mean, the question is like, I'm wondering about the kind of stratification you can observe or notice in Korean Chinese, Korean communities, and whether that sense of like perceived status or class shape the way they relate to other Korean Chinese people there.
Wait, can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
So I'm assuming that there are different kinds of people, as in not all of them are the expats or middle class. So some of them will be like in a different situation where they cannot really like hire Korean Chinese, or they don't really feel like, you know, other Koreans, like other more wealthier Koreans. So if there is any kind of like stratification there, and I'm wondering like how their status or perceived status shape their relationship with Korean Chinese. Okay, great.
And Roland, do you want to ask your question now too?
Oh, hi. Actually, I have 3 short, very short questions. The first is that I think, and firstly, I really love the presentation. Is like a storytelling, so that's really amazing. And my first question is about the identity of Korean Chinese, because you know, the Korean, as I understanding it, there is ethnic minority as Korean Chinese in China. So they could be Chinese. They are born in Chinese, and their nationality also the Chinese, but they could have like Korean traditions or Korean culture, and their parents can be Koreans. So I'm wondering if your study have these nonsense comparison between the Korean Chinese and Korean Chinese. I
understand what you're saying. Like the Chaosian, right? Is what you're talking about.
Yes, it is. And this is my first question. And the second, I just thinking about in like 2016, there is a really stalking event for the let's see, sorry, it's about a let me check the dictionary. Sorry about that. I mean, that's a military base.
Oh, right. The
THAAD, yeah. It is really like a shock towards the Korean and China's relations, and especially as I know, there's many Korean company when their Chinese market has been like shocked, and so I'm also wondering how your do your study connected to it. And the third one is I used to living in Sydney, which is like a really multicultural place, and there is like the largest 3 Chinese community in Sydney, and they even have very different cultural environments in these 3 Chinese communities. So I just wondering if you can maybe include other Beijing's different Korean communities. That could be super interesting, but just for the further studies, like do you know, like 五道口, it seems to be a really large Korean community in Beijing, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, these are great questions, and I'll just combine them. So I think actually Roland and Hojin, some of your questions are really similar in the sense that you're saying, what about the people who are ethnically Korean or Chinese, or maybe ethnically Korean and South Korean, who don't meet the criteria or the categories that seem very rigid that are defining your case study? And that's an excellent question. And I want us to think about, the difference between reality and social reality. And what I mean by that is, in reality, you can't categorize people in these, whether you're Korean, Chinese, or South Korean, right? These are fictive, right? And, actually, Hojin, in my case study, I found a lot of South Koreans who migrated when they were like 15 or 16. So how do you know, right? Are they Korean Chinese then? Are they South Korean? Because they are also fluent in Mandarin. They only spent some of their life in Korea, a lot of their life in China. And some people call them the Xin Chaoxianzu, which is the new Korean Chinese migrants. But I actually think that, there are so many people who you can't categorize. Also for the Chaoxianzu, the Korean Chinese population, I'm looking at people who are in Wangjing. So there are also a lot of Korean Chinese who are assimilated into China, who primarily identify as Chinese. And I don't mean to say that everyone is the same, right? But what I do want us to think about are how large institutions like the state or the corporations, how they are creating actually these very rigid categories. And these rigid categories have a social reality because of the ways that we interact are structured through these institutions, right? And so that is kind of the last idea that I want to leave you with. That also has a big impact. A lot of people left, right? And so in these transnational communities, they are highly volatile to these diplomatic tensions, which also is the case for the Zainichi community as well. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sharon, for your talk. We've kept you over time as well, but thank you as well for answering the questions so well. I want to give you a huge round of applause. It was great, and I hope that we can all get the opportunity to buy your book. Sang-Pil, do you want to advertise the next event before we say goodbye to everybody today?
Right. So next week, same time, 3 o'clock GMT. Presentation will be given by. Sorry, the lecture will be given by Dr. Hae-Shin Yoon at Central European University in Vienna. And she's going to discuss another fascinating topic about the relationship between human, robots, and IT. So I'm sure all of you who joined us today and those who are interested in these topics can also grace your presence just like today. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Bye. Thank you for
Yeah, it's briefly joined.